filming news for one of the pro-presidential TV channels. They'll come and spend a day filming with Babylon 13, just to keep the spirit going and to provide these chronicles. They are planning towards the end of the revolution, the Maidan, to make a documentary film, but as events are unfolding, it's unclear when exactly that's going to be. Initially, they thought that it would be towards the end of March. The thinking when I was in Ukraine were that the presidential elections would be held at the end of March. These protests, the Maidan would force Yanukovych's hand to call them, and but now as events are unfolding, it's unclear. So a little bit of context. I'll start by saying I was in Ukraine in 2010 for the presidential elections with the mission of Canadian observers with the Canada-Ukraine Foundation. Our hands were not tied like the official Canadian observers from the Canadian government with Canada, because they obviously have political reasons to watch what they say. But we were allowed to call a spade when in the region of Bila Tsarkva there were pens with disappearing ink placed into the ballots, into the place where people fill in the ballots. We called that, we drew people's attention to it when the analog version of robocalls happened, meaning that somebody went to some villages and distributed leaflets saying, or distributing letters from the Central Election Commission, fake letters, saying that the elections are canceled due to lack of funding. We were also able to raise those issues at the press conferences we had, and show that there are problems with the electoral process. Now, what ended up happening, of course, was Viktor Yanukovych won by less than 1 million votes. 830,000 votes he won in the second round over Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, Yulia Tymoshenko, between the 2 rounds of elections, managed to gain 5 million more votes, Yanukovych 3 million more votes. At the end of the day, Yanukovych's, the difference that Yanukovych beat Tymoshenko by was almost the same number of votes that the communists got in the first round. So it was like the union of the communists and the Party of the Regions ensured Yanukovych's victory. So the night of the elections, I and a few other Canadians went over to the headquarters of Yanukovych to see what was happening there. And of course there were celebrations, and one of Yanukovych's political technologists, as they're called in Ukraine, came up to me and said, "Hey, why the long face? Why are you so saddened?" He goes, "Don't worry, you'll see, mark my words. Yanukovych will bring Ukraine into the European Union. That Yushchenko guy, he wanted NATO, that was too much. He was an American lackey through his wife, blah, blah, blah," the standard kind of anti-Western rhetoric you hear. But Yanukovych, you'll see, mark my words, he'll bring us into the EU. And sure enough, for several years, it seemed like Ukraine was going to sign some kind of an agreement with the association agreement with the European Union. And then in November, there was a sudden about-face that was the initial impulse for the protests that we see today. That was the European Union issue aside, as we'll see in some of the films, is it wasn't so much about the fact that Ukraine had not become a member of the EU because it was only an association agreement, but part of the public outcry had to do with the fact that here's a government that's spending years and years saying, we're going to do this, and then on the eve of doing this, they did that. And that caused a lot of outrage because, how is anybody going to take my country seriously if, let's say, Canada, we're saying, we're going to join NAFTA for 4 or 5 years, and then all of a sudden we join the EU instead of doing that. It just doesn't make any sense. So what these protests are also about, because they kind of stopped being about the EU issue. The EU issue, the formal issue of the signing, there were no illusions that people are going to start living better overnight just because of an association agreement. But there are several factors in play, and it has become that now there are calls for a complete and total overhaul of the system. From the writing from the new constitution to people are calling for lustration, meaning that people, certain people tied to the regime would not be allowed to hold governmental posts, and it's taken on a whole new meaning, and it's sustained, and right now it's anybody's guess how it's going to end. But the resolve of the protesters on the Maidan and in other parts of the country is growing stronger. In the films that we'll see what's happening, what Donetsk was like in December, and even there's a movement to change things in Ukraine because it's gotten to be too much. In a sense, to understand the ramification of what's happening in Ukraine, and to provide context, a useful thing to think about is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster from 1986, which led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Back then, in 1986, the elites, the nomenklatura, having learned that there was this disaster at the plant outside of Kyiv, they evacuated their families, they got the heck out of Dodge, and didn't tell anybody about it. And it wasn't until the West noted higher levels of radiation that Moscow was forced to admit that something had gone wrong. But it was this attitude of a government that doesn't really care about its people, cares a caste that was in power, that looked after itself and didn't really care about the rest of the people. And of course, the people were allowed, or the people unknowingly went out and attended the May 1 demonstration of the International Workers' Day, and oblivious to what was happening. And when the news got out about Chernobyl, this obviously had a domino effect, and it was cited as by historians as one of the catalysts that led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In many ways, the events happening in Ukraine today have the potential to do the same thing to what Vladimir Putin is trying to build on the post-Soviet space. And we see even in Moscow today, there was a demonstration in support of a oppositional TV station called Dozhd, which means rain. So the protesters came out with umbrellas. They just opened up umbrellas on Red Square, and shortly thereafter the police came and took them and put them into the paddy wagons. So there's fear. There's fear, and of course, right now Russia is more concerned about something called Sochi Olympics, and but after that, we'll see what transpires. What will happen in Ukraine? One possible scenario is as these protests, if they don't manage to take hold in other regions, there is one of the plans in play, I believe, is the federalization of Ukraine. The federalization of Ukraine, meaning that Ukraine is currently a unitary state, and that there is, every time there's any political problems, any political turmoil, the term of federalization comes up, which would create different entities within Ukraine that could decide issues like language and history and economic issues on their own. And this issue is, the issue of federalization is important because there are people within the party of the regions that have spoken out against it. So if there is going to be a movement within the party of the regions, and it's now apparent that Yanukovych is obstinate in his position, the chances of him conceding power voluntarily are next to nil. That the center of power, of political power, would shift to Parliament, and for there to be a resolution reached there, there's going to have to be people from the party of the region is going to have to defect. They're going to have to put the country or their own interests first ahead of their loyalty to Yanukovych. And if that fails, then the street is going to have its say. The street is going to have its say because it is the events of January 19th on Hrushevsko Street, where was when the Maidan had enough of everything, when the politicians, the three leaders of the political parties that are behind the Maidan, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Tyahnebok Oleg, and Vitaly Klitschko, they proved themselves to, the intentions were good, but their abilities to get what the Maidan wanted through were insufficient. So then the Molotov cocktails came out. And that potential is there. And the Maidan right now, this week was a week of, it was a truce. The leaders of the Pravi sector, of the right sector, Dmytro Yarosh, prides himself on the fact that not one Molotov cocktail has been thrown this week, that he's able to control the guys on the ground. But the potential is there. On yesterday, the Maidan marched symbolically to Parliament, where they made a show of force, non-violent, of course, but showed that we can come to Parliament if we want to, and if the center of decision-making moves to Parliament, then the Maidan will be there waiting. And if something goes not the way the Maidan likes, then you can expect a repeat of what happened in 2004, a watershed moment in the Orange Revolution, when the Maidan broke into Parliament, led by Oleg Tyahnebok and the Svoboda Party, and scared everybody. Scared not only the pro-presidential politicians, but the opposition politicians themselves. So people that remember that will act accordingly when and if that time comes. So just to go back to the federalization issue, why is it also important is because we look back to what Vladimir Putin had told George Bush Jr. in Munich in 2008 when they had the Security Council, and he said, George, Ukraine's not even a country. Maybe those 3 oblasts in the west are Ukrainian, but the rest is ours. A Russian writer recently wrote his views of the standard foreign policy dictum that states that without Ukraine, Russia cannot be an empire. Something you learn in Foreign Policy 101. But this Russian writer, Alexander Vasilyev, said, no, you know what, Russia can be an empire or close to it without Ukraine, but without Ukraine, Russia cannot be Russia. This is in line with the new ideology that the Kremlin is propagating called Ruski Mir, Russian world, which holds things holy such as the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as propagating ideas like, well, you know what, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are really one people. Historically, that's always been the case, they argue, but this one people happened to be divided between 3 states, and it's only a matter of time until this one people is governed by one state. Now, how can that happen? There is a legal mechanism by which the Russian Federation can expand its borders, and that is a law adopted in 2001 as Putin was coming to power, and it's a law of the Russian Federation on how foreign states or parts thereof can become members of the Russian Federation. So the mechanism is fairly simple. The foreign state or part thereof that wants to join the Russian Federation holds a referendum, voting yes or no on joining the referendum. Assuming the yes side wins, then the Russian Duma